when you get fit, it will look like grit. You're an athlete, you know this, right? So when I was a college athlete, there were people who were like the grittiest people I've ever seen on the track and complete chickens in the classroom, and vice versa. So grit was not some single trait that ran across their whole life. It was contextually dependent.
This is Running for Real, the podcast for runners who know that for every runner's high, there are just as many lows. All those just missed PRs, easy runs that feel hard, injury blues, and more. Each week, we'll talk to running, health, and wellness experts about their highs, lows, and best advice to build our confidence. Running for Real is about being honest, being brave, and most of all, not feeling alone. And now here's our host, Tina Muir.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode number 134 of the Running for Real podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. So last week you heard from Jenny Faulkner, who is a British radio presenter, TV presenter. If you're British, you definitely would have recognized her voice. If you're American, maybe a bit different, but she was just so lovely, so warm, so welcoming. And it was a very random meetup and recording that I did with her in London while I was home on vacation, but it was just a wonderful conversation. And I really hope if you haven't already followed and enjoyed that episode with Jenny, you will go back and check that one out. Now, today I have someone on my bucket list of dream guests. I'm honored to have him on the show, and he was even better of a person than I expected. And can I just say, I have pretty high expectations of the people that I look up to. I've had one who completely crushed me, wasn't what I expected, but everyone else has been just even greater than I can imagine. So thank you to them for being good, genuine people. I really enjoyed our conversation. We talked a lot about his new book, Range, but it wasn't the focus. We talked a lot about specializing and just kind of went off on a few tangents. So this one is a bit different. I had a few questions, but we kind of went off script a lot and just had a conversation. I did my very best to just listen to what he was saying and respond to that. Remember what Fader was saying in the mental training episode that was in May? He talked about how it's really important for us to just listen and not be thinking about our response before we even get there. So I really tried to do that and not spend so much time trying to link things together, but to actually listen. And I think you will notice that. However, you will also maybe notice that a few times I get a bit tangled up in my words as I was kind of thinking it through as I was talking it. So I apologize if I just sounded completely confusing and rambled on, but he completely got what I was saying. So hopefully it was clear enough. There was not that much running conversation in this chat, but it was fascinating. So I really hope you enjoy it. And before we go meet David Epstein, I want first to thank Body Health, Athletic Greens, and UCAN for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. Sponsors make this all worthwhile, make it all possible. So thank you so much to them for sponsoring this episode. Let's go meet David. Thank you to Athletic Greens for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. As you have heard me saying over the previous few months, for the past 5 months or so, I've been enjoying Athletic Greens as the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning. You've also heard me talking about Michael Gervais before and how he calls, and actually I haven't told you this, he calls Athletic Greens his insurance policy, which is a great way to look at it. And of course, we all try and eat healthy, get lots of colourful fruits and vegetables in. But let's be real, some days, even some weeks, eating healthy is just not really realistic, especially for me when I was home in England. I just go mad on the foods and drinks, yes, the drinks, that I love in England and that I can't get in the US. And of course, very few of those are leafy green vegetables. Thankfully, I had my Athletic Greens travel packs, which meant I could continue taking the Athletic Greens to give me 75 whole food sourced ingredients, vitamins and minerals, digestive enzymes, prebiotics, probiotics, and the antioxidant equivalent of 12 servings of fruit and vegetables before my hectic days even began. You can get yourself a free travel pack with 20 servings when you subscribe for your first month. And that means there's no more green powder explosions in your suitcase. Not that I have had one of those, but we're trying to prevent that here. This is perfect for summer vacations, and that travel pack is valued at $79. They also have a 60-day money-back guarantee. So go to athleticgreens.com/Tina for your offer. That's athleticgreens.com/Tina to get your free travel pack valued at $79 and start your insurance policy. David, thank you so much for joining me on the Running for Real podcast. As I told you before we started recording this, you are on my dream list. This is an absolute, I can barely believe I'm talking to you right now. So thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, the pleasure is totally mine. And maybe you should have bigger dreams if I'm on the dream list, but I appreciate the sentiment.
The next above you is Brene Brown. So if I can get her, I think my life would be made. But that's going to be, she's a few rungs higher of, especially if she's not a runner. She's going to be a bit harder to convince. But thank you so much either way. And, many of my listeners will probably have heard of your book, if not read it, The Sport Gene. And you're also the author of a new book, Range, which we're going to talk about a little bit in the book. But as you mentioned, just for those listeners, I want to mention the fact that David said, we don't have to talk about the book. And that's really says something about an author in themselves. There's a lot of people who are doing their rounds with books and all they want to talk about the entire interview is their book. And it can feel quite inauthentic. So thank you for saying that. And I just wanted to let my listeners know that this is not in any way forced or encouraged. I reached out to him. Everything is just completely natural here. But before we go on to, your writing, your speaking, when I was doing some research on you, this is on your website, I think. Yeah. So it's not like it's some hidden information that I really dug up. But I think it was in the book. I was reading about you saying that for grad school, you spent your time in a tent in the Arctic studying how changes in plant life might impact the subterranean permafrost.
Yes.
Now, first, what does that mean and what did that involve?
Okay, what that basically means is, so in the lower Arctic tundra, so this is north of the Arctic Circle, but not that far north of the Arctic Circle, essentially. The permafrost, it means the ground where I was about a meter below ground, it's frozen. So like if you stuck a stake down, it would feel like you were hitting concrete 1 meter down, totally frozen all year round. There's no time it thaws. And what that means is there's very little nutrients available for the plant life in that part of the world because it's frozen, so not shallowly below ground. And what happens now with the temperature change there is even a tiny bit of melting of the permafrost means a huge input of new nutrients into the plant life there, because they're used to so little that even a little bit of melting of the permafrost liberates these other nutrients and can cause these like very dramatic changes of the kind of plant life there. And what I was trying to figure out was, how can you measure some of those changes and try to figure out, will they end up taking more carbon out of the atmosphere than before, or leading to more carbon in the atmosphere? Because you really want to know if that's a positive or negative feedback cycle, because that will help you determine how it's going to change and whether it's going to be, a big input into climate change or not, essentially. And the way I was doing was trying to use the radiation that plants were giving off to get a not very accurate measure, but a very quick one over large amounts of ground, basically. And
was that something that's exactly what I want to go do? How did you end up there?
Oh, let me think. Should I tell the short, the medium, or the long version? How did I end up there? So actually it has a running hook. So I'll start with the running part.
Yeah.
So when I got to college, I've gotten linearly less goal directed over the course of my life. Basically, when I was a teenager, I was sure I was going to go to the Air Force Academy and be an astronaut. And I sort of dropped at the last second. And when I got to college, I started studying political science, and it turned out it wasn't the fit for me that I thought it would be. And I was a walk-on to my college track team. And there was a guy who was a senior, who was a biomedical engineer, who told me our college is leasing this land out in Arizona, out in southern Arizona. Go out there for the summer, take some classes. Trust me, it's amazing. And the sort of a benefit was, if I took a class out there, then I could take a lighter class load during track season. So I decided to do that because I could take one less class during track season. So I decided to do that. And I go out to this area where the Biosphere 2 is, if you've heard of that.
No.
So Columbia was leasing. It's like this indoor enclosure where people tried to live in a self-sustaining way under glass, and it didn't work, but whatever. But Columbia was leasing this area in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. And I go out there, and the classes you can take are geology and astronomy. That's pretty much it during the summer. And I go out there again, to have an easier track season. And I'm blown away by the desert, and I love it. And I love the geology class. And so I end up majoring in geology and astronomy just because I'm more of this, whatever this is, having no intention to do that. And so I end up majoring in geology, and I worked at this science campus near my university that was all earth sciences. And I got a job on like a ship in the Pacific Ocean and these sorts of things. And one of the labs that was just right next to mine was a guy who was doing this Arctic plant physiology. And I sort of hit it off with him. And when I applied to grad school, you know, ideally you sort of have made contact with some of the scientists there because you're going to work on their particular research. So you want to know, you're kind of interested in what they're doing. And so I ended up just, you know, working in grad school with a guy who was doing that kind of work.
And was that kind of like, oh, wow, this is really cool? Or was that a bit intimidating, thinking, well, I could just, you know, go somewhere like the desert or somewhere in America? Were you excited to be going somewhere really, you know, where very few people go?
Totally. And the Arctic, the area of the Arctic I was in is technically a desert. Even though it's very lush on the ground, the plants are only like a couple inches tall. Okay. But because the air is so cool all year round, there's very little rainfall, so very little atmospheric demand for water. And because there's so little rainfall, it's a desert, and you can see in 360 degrees, which was just like the Arizona desert. And I love that. Like, I love deserts where you can see like everything clinging to its little vein of life, and you can just look all around you. And I grew up in a city, and I wasn't used to that. And so, any way to get back to a desert was good by me. Okay.
And then what about, as this is a topic I'm really passionate about, you mentioned, you know, about the melting of the permafrost.
Wait, before that, can I say one other thing too?
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure,
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no.
You've probably, because I'd be interested in your perspective on this. When I was living in this tent up in the Arctic, I had like one bag full of stuff, right? And my work and this interesting place. And I've like never felt so content in my entire life. I could only worry about the things right in front of me. I had like very few possessions. You know, and in some ways it reminded me of like the best training cycles I ever had when I was running, where it's just like I was so present with whatever I was doing and wasn't worrying about all this other stuff. Yeah. And I just found that to be like a very, you know, I was like almost euphoric way to live. And so some people hated it up there because it was very desolate. So it was interesting to see who loved it. There were only about 40 people at the place where I was, but some people were like, get me out of here. You know, like you don't get to shower very often and all this kind of stuff.
Were they enjoying the work though? Because I feel like if the work was rewarding and it was, you know, what your passion was and what you were interested in, you could kind of overlook the rest of it. Or were they people that were kind of just doing it to get the degree?
I think there was definitely some of I think there was definitely some of doing it just to get the degree, or they were interested in it, but it still involves like a lot of like grunt work, no matter what you're doing, like in the lab. And I think a lot of people, most people I was around, I would say, sort of got on a treadmill for what they were studying in grad school. Like it was, and then they just stayed on it because they were told, even if they wanted to switch, this reminded me of Jay Shree Seth, the character in my book. Even if they wanted to switch, they were told like, you'll get behind. And so they would just sort of end up going down a research track that, whichever was the one they started in, even if they realized maybe it wasn't the one that they wanted to be in. So I think there was a ton of that. I would say that was the norm probably.
Which probably applies a lot to Range, your book there, with that specialization thing. I mean, just reading the book in general, it reminded me of when I was in college. There was a lot of people, pharmacy was a big thing at my school, and there were so many people that started it, and they'd get a few years in and they said they seemed to hate it. But at that point it was like, well, I'm committed now. I've got to keep going. And I was like, you know, I get the money aspect, of course, but at the same time, I thought, oh, that just sounds miserable. So I definitely can see that. And the same kind of thing of the specialization early, which I really want to dive into in a minute. So,
but I interrupted you asking a question about the permafrost.
Yeah. So the permafrost, now looking back at it, is there anyone that's still out there? Like, how have things changed since you did that?
Yeah, the site I was at is called a long-term ecological research site. So it has like perpetual funding every year. And I guess, as is the case with a lot of research like this, the news is not good. So it turned out that what it seemed to be, and I haven't checked in like the last like 2 years or whatever, but was that this liberation of nutrients caused like a new type of plants to grow faster and take over. Which would seem good because then they could take more carbon out of the atmosphere, but they spread a canopy. And so they shaded all the other plants on the ground. And so you end up with like less total vegetation, which is not good.
And still probably doesn't outweigh the water going into the.
Yeah. So so the news, I mean, I think my takeaway is like, there's a tremendous amount of stuff stored in the lower Arctic underground, and like it would be better if we didn't mess with it, at least on fast timescales, because it's a very complex system.
Yep.
And we don't totally understand what it's going to do, because it was very counterintuitive. I didn't think that was going to be the case. I thought the liberation would make more plant life that would actually be able to bring more carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're just changing some things rapidly that we don't understand real well.
Thank you to Body Health for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. Body Health is a wonderful company. You know that, right? Because I really do assess the companies before I work with them. I turned away yet another sponsor recently because I just couldn't see myself using their product at all, and it just didn't feel real. Yes, that was leaving money on the table, but my integrity is still intact, and that's more important to me. Body Health was founded by Dr. David Minkoff, who, by the way, has a new book out, The Search for the Perfect Protein, if you're interested. Dr. David is an MD who founded Body Health in 2000, and in his practice, he concentrates on alternative and complementary approaches. Body Health has a whole host of products to give your body a boost, and especially if your body is working through something stressful like injury, recovering from surgery, sickness, pregnancy, or postpartum, or anything else that means it's working hard, Body Health products are really going to be there to support you. Especially, I love Perfect Amino, which contains all 8 essential amino acids and is quickly absorbed by the body. Each 10-gram serving of Perfect Amino is equivalent to 35 grams in dietary protein, which is something many of us are deficient in. I know I definitely struggle to get enough. You can get 10% off the entire Body Health website by visiting tinamuir.com/aminos. That's TINAMUIR.com/AMINOS.
I think my takeaway is like there's a tremendous amount of stuff stored in the lower Arctic underground, and like it would be better if we didn't mess with it, at least on fast timescales, because it's a very complex system.
Yep.
And we don't totally understand what it's going to do, because it was very counterintuitive. I didn't think that was going to be the case. I thought the liberation would make more plant life that would actually be able to bring more carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're just changing some things rapidly that we don't understand real well.
Yep. I just, I don't know if you saw, I did an episode with Claire Gallagher. That was a few months ago. And she's really passionate about that. And it was just eye-opening hearing her talk about some of the things that she's seen and that are going on. And as I said, that's a passion of mine. So that's why I wanted to ask you about it as well.
Yeah. One of the really funny things that, because I'm interested in career changing, and that's part of like my book is I have my master's research. Eventually, some of it got published in the Journal of Arctic, Antarctic, and Alpine research, I think. Huh. And I changed careers so quickly that by the time it got published, my contact information on the scientific paper is at Sports Illustrated, which is kind of funny.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I hope that like confused some people who saw that.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Well, I still get emails from my old employer, and I left them 3 years ago. So I think some people just don't even. I don't even know how some people stumble across things. But I guess in a paper, there's that is what it is. It's just going to say what it does. But that's interesting to know. Now, just to kind of rub your ego for a second, reading that the sports gene was Barack Obama purchased. How did that make you feel thinking about that? And how did you find out that he purchased your book?
I was in Oxford when that happened. So it was, I guess it was 2013, and it was this thing called Small Business. I think it's Small Business Saturday, where like people are encouraged to go shop at a local business. Okay. And he went to this bookstore that in Washington, D.C., this famous bookstore called Politics and Prose. And the way I found out was somebody I guess he got photographed buying
funny.
The book. And so somebody put it on Twitter, and somebody like texted me the tweet with the photo of him holding the book. And I was like, this is great. And then his book list sort of shows up. And later, I think, I can't know for sure, but I think he actually read it, because once I saw an interview where he was on vacation and somebody was talking about his reading list. And one of them was, they said like it was a book about, science of endurance or something. And he had and then when I think when some Olympic runners we got invited to the White House at some point, one of the runners reported him saying some things that I thought suggested he had probably read it. So I don't know for sure. I'm just inferring that, but
Either way, that's pretty awesome, that even if you've just picked it up and never read it. But the fact that I'm sure he did. I mean, it's an interesting topic and he seems like he is interested in all kinds of things. So just thought I would mention that there. And, you have all these accolades about your writing. You have all these things that you've done. Do you struggle along with everyone else in looking back and thinking, wow, I did all that? Or, we tend to do that with our running, tend to just kind of plow on to the next thing. But do you find that with your work as well? Or are you pretty good at reflecting and being proud of your success?
Oh, I'm good at reflecting. I don't know if I'd say I'm good at reflecting and being proud of my success. I mean, I'm because by the time I'm done with a project, I was talking to Adam Grant about this. I don't know if you follow him at all, but and he was sort of like suggesting that I should be like a little more confident about my work, I guess. And what I was saying is, as soon as I'm done with something, by the time anyone else is consuming it, I'm already like a beginner totally in something else. Right. So, and partly that's been my choice because I've liked to, like, as soon as the Sports Gene came out, 2 weeks later, like, I still sometimes get introduced as a writer at Sports Illustrated. I haven't been there for 6 years. 6 years. Yeah. 6 years. And 2 weeks after the Sports Gene came out, I left and went to ProPublica, this nonprofit investigative operation. I started reporting on drug cartels and medical practices and all this other stuff. And so it's sort of my choice to not do the same thing over and over. And so I'm always trying to like switch projects. And I think that's a good way to develop skills, but I'm constantly feeling like a beginner in whatever I'm doing. And so by the time anyone else is telling me that they enjoyed my book, I'm already like, I'm already at the stage of feeling like, whatever project I'm angling toward is impossible and I'll never get it done. And because every time I finish a project, I feel like, well, that was really lucky. Like I probably won't get that lucky again, So
you see that as luck though, rather than.
Well, I don't know. People try to convince me, I guess there's a lot of different kinds of luck. There's like Hank Aaron, right? He got lucky like 40 times a year for 20 straight years. So obviously he used to hold the home run record. And so I've come around to, I was reading this. I really like Irish playwrights. There's some Irish playwrights who are among my favorite writers. And one of them is a youngish guy named Connor McPherson. And I was reading him saying like how it like resonated with me so deeply. He said after he's one of the like, greatest living playwrights. And he was saying, every time he finishes a play and it goes well, he's kind of like, well, that'll probably be the last time. And it felt the same way. And he said, as he's gotten older, that's happened enough times that he doesn't feel differently about that emotionally, but he's learned to understand that for whatever reason, he'll keep coming across good projects if he keeps following his interests. And so I've sort of logically feel that way too, but because when I finish a project, they're so self-contained in some ways and I have no idea what I'm doing next. I do still, I'm already in the beginner mindset and I do feel like you do have to get some luck. I think there's been more luck involved in my career successes than people would intuit. But I think that's the case for a lot of people who are successful, that we underplay the role of luck. And anyone who has like some, unless you're like a celebrity, I think anyone who has like some best-selling books has to have some luck involved for sure.
I can see that.
I mean, like Barack Obama buying the book was really helpful. Right. I had nothing to do with that good thing it was published at a time where it was still in the bookstore when he happened to walk in, and good thing like it was at the bookstore, small, independent bookstore on Small Business Saturday or whatever.
But then do you think at the same time, it must have been very good writing and very interesting in a topic that so many people resonated with, that enough people must have mentioned it to him. This is such a good book. You have to read it, that he thought, oh, I have to listen to them. And if you hadn't done good work, they wouldn't have taken the time to suggest it.
Yes, I definitely feel that way. Yeah, I feel that way. It's like I get my head so inside. Like I write a little bit about the inside view in Range, where you sort of lose perspective. And I get that in a big way. So when I'm done with a book, like I've gone away for whatever, a couple of years, nobody's really read it. I don't do lots of like early readers. And when I come up for air, I have no idea. I know I've done something that isn't out there already, that I'm aware of. Yeah. But I have no idea if it's like going to resonate with people or if I've like totally missed the ballpark. And so I gather the fact that it resonated with a lot of people, like that, That's great. Because like one of the reasons I wrote the Sports Gene was because I couldn't get as much of that stuff into Sports Illustrated because the editors felt, and they were probably right, that the audience didn't necessarily have a tolerance for like the constant science. You could do it once in a while, but not all the time.
Yeah.
And so I sort of had this feeling that, okay, these are my side interests. Because all the Sports Gene, like, it was just like a examination of my own questions about the balance of nature and nurture in sport that came from either participating or viewing sports. And I guess now I'm convinced that if I find something really interesting, there's probably a bunch of other people that will also find it really interesting. So I've learned that the one thing you have to have is taste. You have to have taste. Like you may not be a good writer yet or whatever, but if you don't have good taste about like something that's interesting, then you're in trouble. So I gather that I have reasonable taste about things that are interesting. But I mean, one of the other reasons I think I feel this way is I read a ton. Like when I'm in my research phase, I try to read 10 scientific journal articles a day, every day for the first year. Don't even start writing. And when I'm really reading, I'll read several books a week, at least. Because that's like part of my job. And so I come across a lot of brilliant writers who did not find commercial success, right? Some, a lot of brilliant writers do, but like a woman I've been reading recently named Rachel Ingalls. Okay. She sort of inspired. Can I just sort of go on a digression here? Is that fair? Okay. And interrupt me if like you want to go some other way, because I have a very digressive brain that I try to organize on the page. So to fool people, but so she wrote these books, these great novellas in the 1980s, with the most famous one called Miss Caliban, and got like no attention. And then sometime much more recently, then this British Book Marketing Council picked Miss Caliban as one of the 20 most important works by a living American writer after World War II. So suddenly she's on this list with Toni Morrison and Philip Roth and all these people, but she still doesn't find commercial success. Her book gets republished like 2 years ago because Miss Caliban is basically the plot of The Shape of Water, the movie that won the best Oscar. It's kind of startling. It's like a woman who has an affair with an escaped sea monster. They even both have jokes about cornflakes. So it's a little like, I wonder if there was some influence here, but whatever. I don't know. But so I started reading her books because they're now getting republished, even though she wrote them in the 80s. She gets profiled in the New Yorker a couple months ago for the first time, right? Passes away like 2 weeks later.
Oh, wow.
But I'm reading her stuff and I'm like, this woman is brilliant. Yeah. Like she's brilliant. She's her writing economy, like how few words she needs to say something is brilliant. And like, I aspire to that level of writing economy, and she got no attention until like 2 weeks before she passed away. So that's constantly in my mind, that there are just some brilliant people who don't. Yeah,
I can see what you're saying.
So while I think I've done a good job or done something interesting, I also think I still need luck.
Okay. Last question on this kind of point then. So I listened to a podcast recently with Elizabeth Gilbert, and she was saying about when she finished Eat, Pray, Love, she finished it and she felt she said for her, the pride, the kind of emotional rush of just, this is the best feeling. It's not so much when her books come out, when they're successful, but it's when she's completed it. And she just said for her, she didn't care if no one picked up that book and ever thought it was any good, but she felt proud and felt just this incredible sense of satisfaction. Did you at least get some sense of that with each of your books? Or was it, you said you weren't sure if it was going to resonate with anyone?
Yeah, I'll tell you when I do get the rush. So first of all, the Sports Gene, I got to do all this travel that I had wanted to do anyway, right? So that's like a gift. Like that was something I always wanted for part of my job to travel around the world. And I'm normally, my like natural state is sort of shy. Like I can talk a lot, but I'm sort of, if you've read Susan Cain's book, Quiet, that like really resonated with me, where she's like, an introvert doesn't mean they're shy or they won't talk. It's just like when it's lots of socializing all the time and lots of group of strangers, they're more likely to be more reserved and they recharge by being on their own. Right. So I actually think a lot of distance runners are introverts because they have to spend a lot of time in their own head, basically. Yeah,
that makes sense.
And so journalism and reporting and writing made me much more like pushed me out of my comfort zone to talk to lots of strangers. So here I go around the world. And when I'm in a place as a writer, and I know I'm going to have to write about it, I experience a country in a completely different way than if I'm just there visiting, right? I have to like really have deep conversations with people and learn about their jobs and their workplaces and all these. So I get these experience of a place, and I was on every inhabited continent, I think, during the reporting of the Sports Gene. And you just learn about these places that in a way that I never would otherwise. Like the last chapter of the Sports Gene focused on this cross-country skier who had a rare mutation that caused him to basically be like naturally on EPO, essentially. Mm-hmm. Except it was really that his body was extremely sensitive to his own EPO. So he would overproduce red blood cells. And so I had to make this, at first I had to find out if he's even alive, right? He doesn't speak English. And then I have to go meet him above the Arctic Circle where he's a reindeer farmer, right? And get like his daughter to translate. And it's just amazing. Like I would never go track down a great Olympian reindeer farmer above the Arctic Circle if it weren't for the story. But I'm so glad that I did. So I get a high out of those things. And like in range, I made a find of some historical documents when I was writing a chapter about music. And when I started finding these documents in these like unused archives of a library, I get a total buzz out of that. And so I do think I would probably enjoy being a historian, because when I come across these old documents and I find something and I realize like nobody has quite found these in the same way, I get really I get a thrill out of that for sure.
So that may be the next direction in the future then?
I have no idea. I truly have no idea what's next, and I'm more comfortable with that than I've ever been before.
Thank you to Generation UCAN for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. UCAN has been my fuel choice for many years. I used the superstarch before my race through bars and powders, and then I used it during the race as I carried a bottle of the powder in my shorts for the Boston Marathon, taking it every 3 miles or so. I've also used it exclusively for my PR marathon when I ran a 2:36 at California International Marathon, taking only that and run gum during the race. And the run gum, by the way, was more for a mental kick of energy, just to kind of, well, not even so much energy, but a wake-up burst. Now, I may not be training for a marathon now, but I still love those damn peanut butter bars. They are so good. And I have the protein powder post-run a lot of days in the week. And I put a lot of fruit in the blender. And if I'm on the go, it's just the perfect thing to grab quickly and know that I'm getting lots of nutrition as well as my protein. If you are training for a marathon, I've only come across a few people out of thousands who have said it upsets their stomach. It really is gentle on the stomach, and it doesn't leave you with those nasty crashes when your energy runs out, as it's a steady release of energy. You can get 25% off by visiting tinamuir.com/UCAN or by using code TINAMUIR25. That's TINAMUIR 25. Yes, even if you have purchased UCAN before. I love it, and I have a feeling you will too.
It's just amazing. Like I would never go track down a great Olympian reindeer farmer above the Arctic Circle if it weren't for the story. But I'm so glad that I did. So I get a high out of those things. And like in range, I made a find of some historical documents when I was writing a chapter about music. And when I started finding these documents in these like unused archives of a library, I get a total buzz out of that. And so I do think I would probably enjoy being a historian, because when I come across these old documents and I find something and I realize like nobody has quite found these in the same way, I get really I get a thrill out of that for sure.
So that may be the next direction in the future then?
I have no idea. I truly have no idea what's next, and I'm more comfortable with that than I've ever been before.
That's perfect. That's great. All right. So you wrote the Sports Gene because of your friend Kevin, and with range, where did this come from? Was this just kind of you noticed it within yourself? Was it someone else talking about this conversation or this topic? Where did that idea come from?
There were sort of two main things. The first was after the Sports Gene, I got invited to debate Malcolm Gladwell.
Yep.
And it's up on YouTube, 10,000 Hours versus the Sports Gene at this conference called the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. And I'd never met him. And he's very clever. And I didn't want to get annihilated on stage. So I prepared a lot more than he did. And I tried to anticipate his arguments. I knew he'd have to argue about the importance of early specialization in sports as being like an insurmountable advantage because he'd written about that. And so I went and looked at all the studies I could find and saw that, well, actually in most, but not all sports, but most sports, athletes who go on to become elite typically have what's called a sampling period, where they play a variety of sports, variety of physical activities. They get these broader skills. They learn about their own interests. They learn about their own abilities, and they delay specializing until later than their peers who plateau at lower levels. And so in the debate, I brought that up and said, this is your hypothesis that the most important advantage is an early start. And this is the data. So it cannot fit. right? Can't fit.
Mm-hmm.
And when we came off the stage, he goes, you know what you really got me on was that we called it the Roger versus Tiger thing, because it was contrasting how Tiger Woods was an early specializer and Roger Federer played about a dozen different sports. And
did you have those two examples in the debate?
I can't remember if we discussed those right on stage or right after, but I think it came up on stage. I think we did discuss it. I'd have to watch the video again, but I think we did. Yeah, it was either Roger or Steve Nash. I brought up one of those. He was the 2-time NBA MVP who didn't even touch a basketball till he was 13. And so then Malcolm invited me the next day to run with him. He's like he was a Canadian provincial champion in the 1500, and he's like a borderline world-class runner for his age group. And I was out of shape then. And he took me, and so, he smashed me. And then I was like, well, I can't let that happen more. So then I had to start working out again. And then we became like running buddies, and we would talk about this stuff on our own time, the Roger versus Tiger issue. Like, when is it good to specialize late or early? And I was so not ready to write another book. Like, I need recovery after the book process. So I filed that away in the back of my brain. Mm-hmm. And then like 2 years later, I get invited to talk to this group of military veterans who'd been given scholarships from the Pat Tillman Foundation, this foundation named for this NFL player who left his NFL career to go to Afghanistan and was killed. And they get these scholarships for career changes. And I was invited to talk to them because one of my college training partners was a Tillman scholar. He'd gone to the Marines. And so he invites me, and I talk about late specialization in sports because I'm like, well, maybe they'll see an analogy because they're switching careers. And then I tack on like the last 5 minutes, some research from outside of sports. And they absolutely ate it up. Like, this Navy SEAL, ex-Navy SEAL who was in grad school in Harvard and Dartmouth at the same time during that talk sent me this note saying how relieved he was to hear that you didn't necessarily have to be doing the same thing your whole life. And I'm like thinking nobody in their right mind would think that this guy, like everything he does, like exudes excellence, right? And he still feels this sort of neurosis about being behind. And so it brought the conversation Malcolm and I had been having like back to my mind. And I started to think, gosh, maybe sports is just the analogy. Like, it was almost their feedback, how much they saw it as an analogy for their own lives. It said to me, maybe I should use it as an analogy for other domains. And so that became the introduction to the book. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the reaction of them seeing this sports data as just an analogy of their lives that said to me, like, well, maybe I should just use it as an analogy to the rest of the world. And that's in fact how the book works, basically.
Yeah. And it's awesome. Like, when I went into the book, I opened it up, I was expecting it all to be about sports. And in fact, there was so many other topics, and you mentioned music. That was something would never have crossed my mind as something that would be featured in your book. But I really just enjoyed kind of seeing those, different analogies. And for someone listening who's thinking, okay, well, I understand the not specializing early, but I'm just an average person. I'm not an elite. I'm not an expert in any topic. Can you just kind of drive home the point that you're not necessarily just talking about people who are the best in the world at something? This kind of applies across the board.
Yeah, no, not at all. So you mentioned something. I was just writing down a couple things to come back to. So you mentioned when we were talking about grad school, right? People who get on a track and they just stay on it because of what's called the sunk cost fallacy. They feel like once you've put some time in, you can't get off. And this is the sunk cost fallacy, like bedevils humans in all decision making, right? This is how, so con men know to work by like asking you for small things first and then escalating to big things, because once you've put in a little, you'll say like, well, I've started a little, so I'll just keep going. And so the question of, is early or late specializing better for sort of normal people? So one economist who had this same question found a natural experiment in the English and Scottish higher ed systems. So in England, you have to specialize relatively early because you have to apply for the period he studied, you have to apply to certain specific programs of study. Mm-hmm. And in Scotland, you can keep sampling later if you want. It's sort of more like the US, basically. And his question was, who wins the trade-off, the early or the late specializers? And in fact, the early specializers do jump out to an income lead after college because they have more domain-specific skills in whatever they're doing. But the later specializers get to test more possible paths. And so they end up with what's called higher match quality. That's the term economists use to describe the degree of fit between someone's abilities and interests and the work they do, which turns out to be incredibly important for persistence and for performance. And so when they get out, they have faster growth rates because they've picked a better fit. And so really quickly, they erase that income gap. And then the early specializers start quitting their career tracks in much higher numbers because they were made to choose so early that they made poor choices. Now, I should say, when they do quit, they also then end up with higher growth rates because they quit and find a better fit. So they're quitting in response to good information, but the late specializers end up winning the trade-off much more often. And so I think that's kind of one of the themes. There's sort of one of the major themes in range is about match quality, is how people find like what they're fit to. And most of the evidence shows that the earlier you match, you might get lucky, but the less likely you are to optimize your match quality, and that's sort of a journey through your whole life in trying to figure out where you best fit.
So it's interesting you mentioned there about that being England and Scotland, because for me, I actually was thinking that I was coming at it from a different angle. Being in England, when I was at school at least, quite a lot of people in my class took gap years, which I did too. And you take that year after high school to kind of discover who you are, essentially. Like some people go backpacking in Thailand. I came to America being nice and original there. But I feel like for me, that was a huge like growth year. And I learned about what I liked, what I enjoyed, and not just areas of interest, but who I was and what traits I had that were going to kind of come into my future. Any thoughts on gap years? Like, because we don't really see that here in the US.
No.
Do you feel like that is a big thing that maybe more people should do?
Absolutely. And I don't know how gap years compare from among like Scottish students versus English students or anything like that. But no, I think so. The period of fastest personality change, you mentioned getting to know yourself over your. So there's this thing called the end of history illusion that I write about a bit in Range, which is this psychological finding that at every time point in life, if we're asked about how much we changed, like our values, our personality, our interests, all these things, we recognize that we've changed a lot in the past, but then underestimate how much we'll change in the future. And we do this at every time point in life, every single one. And it leads to these really funny results. Like if people are asked how much money they would pay for tickets to see their favorite band, their today's favorite band, but 10 years from now, the average answer is $129. And if they're asked how much they would pay to see today their average band from 10 years ago, the average answer is $80 because we underestimate how much our taste will change, basically. And the fastest time of personality change in your entire life is from the age of 18 to your late 20s. So change is faster than people estimate over your whole life. But that period is so crucial for sort of trying to figure yourself out and doing things that will give you like signal about your skills and your interests and your place in the world and knowing yourself, that I think anything we can do to give people more things to try during that period is going to help them better fit with the things that they're doing. And in the long run, that's so tremendously important, right? I have this saying that a researcher told me. Everyone knows the concept of grit, basically, which is like persistence. And what some of his work has shown, as he said, as he summarizes it, is when you get fit, it will look like grit. Because if people know themselves and what they want to do well, and they get into a spot that fits them well, they display all the characteristics of grit anyway, right? You're an athlete, you know this, right? So when I was a college athlete, there were people who were like the grittiest people I've ever seen on the track and complete chickens in the classroom, and vice versa. So grit was not some single trait that ran across their whole life. It was contextually dependent. So anyway, point being, I think the more we can help people learn about themselves and vary that, because our insight into ourselves is constrained by our roster of previous life experiences. So I think a gap year, I understand why it might be difficult for some people to do that. But I think even a gap year of not traveling, of just working anything, instead of going straight into like a long program, of study, is a good idea.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things change in the coming years. And I would love to see more people starting to do things like that, but I'm not holding my hopes up. But let's go back to...
No, me neither.
Let's go back towards children for just a minute. But now we've talked about this specialization thing. Now, for someone listening who sees some talent early on in their child, or sees talent in a child they coach or at school or something, what would be your suggestion based on what you have found with that child? Is it a good idea to kind of encourage them to practice and work towards it, being the best they can in that? Or do you encourage people to continue doing multiple sports, even if one is by far better than the rest?
The first thing I think to be wary of is So, for example, there's a famous study of developing tennis pros, and it was done in Sweden, and some of the kids went on to become like top, I think one or two went on to become top 10 in the world, and a couple went on to become top 100 in the world. Most, of course, did not. And one of the findings was that when the kids were younger, as soon as they were identified as really talented, they were usually put into what the researchers called more restrictive environments, meaning that whatever they were doing that was working, someone would look at them and say like, wow, this kid's really good. If we put them on like a real training plan, they'll be really good.
Yeah.
And they would essentially take them out of what was working and put them into much more technical training, which gives them an advantage in what's called closed skills, like these technical skills, but not the skills that are often the most important. They can give you a quick advantage, but they are not necessarily the most important skills in the long run. And especially for girls, that happened even more for girls. So if a girl was identified as really talented, someone would take her out of whatever she was doing and put her in like an incredibly regimented program right away. And almost all of those girls quit by the time they were 17. Almost all of them.
Reminds me of what you were talking about earlier about having just your little space when you were in grad school. It's kind of that same thing of like, now these girls have, or kids have all these other things that they have to be thinking about rather than just doing it.
Totally.
Sorry, continue.
Anyway, so that wasn't good for persistence, obviously. So you saw this very poor rate of the best juniors becoming the best seniors because most of the best juniors ended up quitting, basically. So first, I think we have to be very wary of putting someone in a very restrictive environment of, when we identify them as talented. And I think we see things like that in running sometimes too, right? Like some of the people who are allowed, one of the runners I've been a fan of for a long time, Nick Symmonds, I think, one of the best 800 meter runners in the world for a decade. Not one of the people you would have identified as the, most likely to do that coming out of college. And I think it's a huge advantage that he ran in Division III, where he was allowed to develop very slowly. And then when he got out of college, you saw he continued to develop very slowly. And sometimes people even said like, he's not working hard enough. But in fact, he stayed healthy much more. He stayed motivated and he just improved a little by. So like, whereas someone like Lauren Fleshman, who I also love, she was like a luminary in college. And then she comes out and is like hitting it hard, right? And is like doing really well, but then pretty soon is like injured all the time, basically. So I think Nick, and that was the same for me in college. I was a walk-on and left as a university record holder. And it was like a blessing in disguise. I was a walk-on. So like nobody cared about trying to like develop me too fast. So I was able to sort of come along slowly. So to get back to your question, what would I do if a kid's identified as very talented in one sport, much more so than in other sports? I think it's fine for them to focus on that sport to some degree, because I think the multi-sport findings are actually about diversity of movement and diversity of challenge, and less so about the fact that they're putting on a basketball jersey instead of a soccer jersey. So I think when you see like France, for example, which, won the last World Cup, they overhauled their soccer development pipeline. The last men's World Cup, they won, of course. The best team in the world won the most recent World Cup.
Yeah. Okay.
We have to have, soccer.
I know.
pride.
I'm still sore about that. It's okay.
So decades ago, France started reforming their development pipeline to emphasize some of these principles, where they realized some of these kids are going to be pushed. They're going to come into the sport very early for one reason or another, but that they still want this diversity of challenge that seems to make like the more creative athletes, and where you do what some scientists call learning like a baby. You want to be like when babies learn language, they get tossed in and they struggle and try, and only later you teach them the grammar. So it looks like the same way for sports skills. You don't want to teach the grammar first, or you hamper people's long-term development. And this is, again, another theme in range, is that sometimes the things you can do to cause the fastest short-term development can undermine long-term development, which is very counterintuitive. But so what they did is they'll take the kids in, but they're not playing like on full soccer fields. They're playing, on different shaped fields with different types of balls, different number of players. So they're still playing a sport with a ball in their feet, but it's being changed all the time. And they have this, one of the guys that designed the pipelines has this saying, there's no remote control. And what that means is the coaches shouldn't be trying to micromanage the players. And so they're only allowed to talk at certain designated times. And so I think they did a brilliant job of allowing kids to come into the sport early, if that's the sport they want to do, but also like making it as if it's almost multiple sports.
Yeah. Kind of just keeping it fun.
Yeah. Judy Murray, who the mother of Andy and Jamie Murray, she has a camp where she basically does the same thing, where people will take their kids out of the British tennis development and give them to her, which is okay because of her name. They feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah.
And then she has them playing tennis through tree branches and all these other like crazy exercises. So it's like they're kind of playing tennis, but not really. They're just doing all these other
as well. Yeah.
And so, because I think the important research finding to keep in mind is this one called breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. The transfer is the term psychologists use to describe your ability to take your skills and knowledge and apply them to situations you haven't seen before. And as sports levels get higher, that's what you're doing. And the breadth of your training, the amount of different challenges you faced early on is what predicts your ability to do that. And so I think she's sort of brilliantly doing that. And so the kids are still playing tennis as far as their parents can tell, but really they're just doing this incredible mix of challenges that happen to have a ball and a racket, basically. And so I think we can actually find a medium between putting the kids in a certain sport. Even Cirque du Soleil, I cut this from range, but I spent some time with the physiologists there because they have amazing athletes. And a bunch of Cirque du Soleil performers are former Olympians.
Oh, really?
And
from what sports?
Gymnastics and trampoline. Yeah, mainly. And sometimes weightlifting.
Oh.
And there's some, if you've ever seen some of the shows, there's these people who like throw other people and stuff like that. But yeah, a bunch of trampoline. They recruit from the Olympics from trampoline. And they decided, like looking at some of this research, to have their performers learn the basics of several other performance disciplines, not because they were ever going to perform them, but because they thought it might have some advantage. And subjectively, they thought it had a creativity advantage for creating new performances. But objectively, they found it cut their injury rates by about 30%. So they measure their injury rates next to Canadian Gymnastics. It's a Canadian company. And so they've implemented that program now where they are taking precious training time. Like if you think of people who have to do those kind of performances, anything that takes away from them training, like practicing their main discipline, better be really important. Yeah. And they feel that that's had such an impact and is so important that they take away some of that training time to have them just do these other things to diversify their physical challenges.
So on this topic, this is a little bit off to the side, but you mentioned the soccer, the World Cup winning, particularly the US women winning the soccer World Cup recently. And there's a few things that kind of come to mind with this. One being, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the US, both men and women grow up playing high school soccer, right?
Yeah.
So that
all of the women on the US women's national team were multi-sport athletes.
Okay. Well, that's good in itself.
But soccer was part of it. Yeah.
Okay. So everyone grows up playing soccer. In England, only men grow up playing soccer.
Yeah.
I've never ever played soccer in my life. But firstly, how did the women reach the top level of the US or the world soccer kind of circuit, whereas the men haven't? Yeah. When is that a case of just there's more men in general playing, or do you see it as women are kind of pushed more into that to kind of, you specialize early, you show a talent in soccer. Soccer is a woman's, it's kind of a sport that women get pushed into. Is any part of that because they are kind of pushed down that road? You're good at soccer, you keep going with it. Sorry, I'm not sure if that makes sense.
No, I mean, well, all of our there've actually been some articles about how the women on the U.S. women's national team played a bunch of different sports. So I don't think they were pushed to only focus when they were younger, and some of them even into quite older ages, like Alex Morgan. But I think there's one factor that like trumps all the others in American women's dominance in soccer, which is that there are way more opportunities in this country for them. And I think it's, if you go around most of the world, I'm not saying the opportunities for women to play any sport in the United States are equal, but they are far in advance of most other countries in the world. Like you go to a lot of other countries and like the opportunities for women to actually develop in sports, beyond being like little kids are like pitiful most of the time. And so I think this should be seen, and I think this should be talked about more because, I think some of this comes out of Title IX, right, which created more opportunities for women to play sports. And so I would say that the United States is not very good at optimal individual development in sports. So if you watched, there was a recent HBO Real Sports special, you got to see it, on Norway. Norway like exploded the last Winter Olympics, right?
Yeah, they did, yeah.
And they've banned basically formal competition before the age of 12. So they have like no focusing athletes before 12.
I did hear that, yeah.
And it's crazy. But they're such a small country, they have to focus on optimal development of a smaller number of people. Whereas in the U.S., we don't have to do that. Our college system, right? I think our college track system, track and field, supports something like 30 to 40,000 young adults in training, right? I'm not sure the rest of the world has that many like 18 to 22-year-olds combined who are being supported in training. And so we don't have to optimally develop people because we can throw a ton of people into the talent funnel and the ones who survive come out. But then when you're in a sport where the rest of the world is really competitive, like in men's soccer, that's not good enough anymore.
I see. Yeah,
right?
That's interesting.
But in women's soccer right now, a lot of other countries, if they want to catch up, they need to give women opportunities. So our college soccer system for women, like we have a huge number of opportunities for women who are young adults, right? Is basically the minor leagues for soccer. Our college system, I think Rose Lavelle, who scored like that fantastic goal yesterday in the Women's World Cup final, like she played at Wisconsin, right? Like if she's born in some other country, she doesn't really have that opportunity to be playing when she's 22 years old at a college team. And so I think other countries are going to continue to get smashed for the most part unless they decide to actually create these opportunities for women. And so I think it speaks well to some of the influence of Title IX. And I think it speaks poorly to the opportunities for women in a lot of other countries.
Do you think does any part of you worry with this win at the World Cup that now, you mentioned all the women were multi-sport athletes, that now any soccer players coming through that do show talent are going to be forced to specialize early because, you could be part of a future World Cup team?
Yeah, no, I always worry about that. But I do think at the same time that there are people involved in U.S. soccer who are sort of getting the message about better development. Like the Aspen Institute has this thing called Project Play, where they talk about like how youth sports should be. And they had some great panels where they brought in the people who designed the French and the Netherlands development pipelines. And the Americans, I think, are really learning from them. So I think, but it takes some time, because but I think some things are moving in the right direction. So I have some hope that the people who are really in charge of like the most important development pipelines, like up to the national team, are actually starting to get this message. Outside of them, I think not so much, right? Because when I lived in Brooklyn until pretty recently, and there was a U7 travel soccer team that met at like a park right across from me. Like, I don't think there's a single person in the world that thinks 6-year-olds can't find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people that they have to travel, right? That's preposterous. But they're customers for whoever's running that league, right? Because we don't have this centralized development like some other countries do. And so it's to that coach or league owner's advantage to keep those customers from other sports. Yeah. And so I do worry about that. But I think some of the people in very influential places are getting the message. So I expect our men's side, with some significant lag, because I think this is the to get better over decades.
Oh, I realize it's just a matter of time until your men are up at the top. Like, we know that you're coming. Okay. And then just one more thing related to that. People probably like, why are you always going on about kids and playing sports? But this is something that's really important to me. Does any part of you think, there's multi-sport and then there's kids now have too many scheduled activities, we're driving from soccer track practice to dance practice to ice skating to art to this to that, and they don't have enough time to kind of free play. And we mentioned discovering who you are, kind of figuring out yourself, mastering yourself. Is any part of that gone in this culture?
I think so. And I mean, I think a lot of, I'm a new parent also. And I think a lot of peers I see, sometimes I feel like they're spending more time driving than the people are actually doing the activities, which doesn't make any sense to me, since, young kids are going to learn no matter what they're doing. So they should be spending the time like doing something. And I think within those activities, like the devil's in the details, like in taking an art class or dance or soccer, whatever it is, like they can be exploring and doing free play and all those things in those instances. It's just that in a lot of those programs, that's probably not the case, because there's some adults there and they want to feel like they are teaching them very concrete skills. And so they do this sort of more technical things. So, I think it's good to have exposure to a lot of activities. I think it helps you find things you're interested in, but I think a lot of it early on should be learner directed, right? That's one of the other findings, like the research on the German men's team that won the 2014 World Cup found that not until they were 22 did they start doing more technical training than amateur league players. But they but starting in their mid-teen years, they were doing more self-directed training. So I think the devil's in the details, but I don't think it makes sense to spend so much time driving when the self-directed activity is like the most important thing at that age anyway.
Mm-hmm. Especially if they have to sit and watch screens in the back of the car for 4 hours trying to go between activity to activity, if that's the only way of keeping them happy.
And I don't think it's like probably not the most fun thing in the world to do for the parents either, I would think.
No, not the parents I've spoken to that do that. Absolutely not. Now, let's zoom out a one
other thing on that, and since you were an elite athlete, and is, again, as I mentioned before, the easiest people to convince about this are elite athletes because they know what they did and they know what it's like to be an elite performer. And so it's like, it's never someone who is a professional athlete who is like, yes, the kid like absolutely has to focus. Never.
But do you think any part of that is because we've had that satisfied? Like, whereas someone who hasn't ever been spectacular at something, they might have a child who shows promise and they think, oh, if only I could know what that feels like, even though it's not them, it's their child. Yeah. But elite athletes know how that feels to be kind of, I hate to say it, but like above the rest.
But doesn't that feel great? Wouldn't you want that for your kid?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So is that why people kind of fall into that trap of kind of wanting to push them hard because they want to experience that?
Maybe. I don't totally know. Like, I was thinking about that college admissions scandal recently where the parents were like paying for their kids to get into college, even if they didn't want to go to college. And the only way I can make sense of that to myself is if these parents are thinking of their kids as like jewelry, right? Like some of those kids, like one of those girls was like saying how she didn't even want to be in college, right? And they like bribed her way in. And so you're sort of like, it's clearly not being done for her benefit. It must be being done for like the parents' benefit. So I don't know, but I don't know that I would necessarily think that an elite athlete would less want their kid to have that experience than a non-elite athlete. I'm not sure. Yeah,
I guess I haven't thought. I'll have to think about that a bit more because, I don't think I do. I think if my daughter wants to run or wants to do something and really go for it, great. But I'm going to be the last person that's going to push her hard because I don't know. I guess it's kind of when I had Jared Ward on my podcast, he talked about how he did the Olympics and then 1 month later he woke up and he realized nothing had changed. And I guess it's kind of like that I can see that's great if she achieves a success. And being my daughter, I have a feeling she probably will learn that, want to be successful from me. But at the same time, I guess I kind of feel like she doesn't have anything to prove at this point.
But don't you also think maybe that you having done it and realizing how much work it takes, that like it's not something... Like if somebody has to really be pushed to do it externally, either it's not going to be sustainable or like they're not going to like it. Like,
absolutely. You have to. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, that's 100%. I think that's it. I'm going to think about that a bit more though. Interesting thought. All right. So let's talk about adults. For someone who's listening, who's thinking, running is the only real passion I have. And I don't have, I have kids, I have a job, I don't have the time to do anything else. Is there any harm in me just, going all out? I have these big goals in running. I just want to get those. Do they need more than one thing to kind of pursue?
I mean, if they are having a job and they already have a passion outside of work, I'd say they're ahead of the game. If running's become that passion for them, like running became a passion for me and I only came to it because I broke my arm playing football. So I like never would have even known. What I would say is if they have a passion, absolutely follow it. I'd say it's if they're, the other part of their work life. I mean, if they're satisfied, if they're like happy at work and they're happy with their running passion, like by all means, like go for it. I don't think I would force someone to diversify, but I think within their job, the way the work world is changing and how quickly it's changing, so many people's jobs are going to have to change many times over the course of their career. Even if they stay at the same job, their job is going to effectively change. And so I think in their work life, it's important for people to be doing what's called skill stacking, basically, where you're not like settling in a plateau and sort of getting comfortable, right? If you think about this as a runner, if you do the same thing, the same amount and same speed every day, like you're not going to get worse, but you're also not going to get better. You're not going to cause adaptation, right? Or if you go to the gym and lift the same weights the same number of times every day. And so I think we need to be cognizant of getting out of these ruts of competence, because there's plenty of research that suggests that people that just by doing something will get better to a certain point, but then will plateau and get into this rut of competence. And I think that is the norm for most things that most people do.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if their work life isn't their passion, you need to be sort of trying other things so that you can, the skill stacking is this concept where you don't have to be like the number one best at anything. Like I didn't have to be the best scientist or the best writer, but when you combine those things, suddenly I'm on this ground where like not very many people are competing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I would encourage that, not just going through the motions at work, even if they have a passion outside. Because I kind of think everyone can find a work passion too.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
But that it doesn't just come to you. So that's why I loved the work of this woman named Herminia Ibarra that I wrote about in Range, where she has this saying I love: we learn who we are in practice, not in theory, which means you actually have to do stuff to figure out what's available and what you're good at. There's this whole industry of like personality quizzes that tries to convince you that you can just introspect and then you'll know what to do. But it turns out that's not validated, and there's like it's not research backed. And so I think we should just be constantly running what I call these experiments. So I have like a book of small experiments where I use, like I did when I was a grad student, I write down something I want to learn, or some skill I want to try, or something I want to gain new insight into. And then I find some little way to test it and reflect on my conclusions and go forward. And so I think we should take to our work life a little bit like the way you take to training, where you have to kind of figure yourself out, right? There's a period of learning, and the higher level you get to, maybe the more you realize like you can't just do exactly what other people are doing, because you recover different, or you focus differently, or you improve from different types of things. And so I think that approach can really translate to other types of improvement. But if someone feels great about their work and great about their running passion, like do it, you're good. I wouldn't tell anybody not to do the things that they're passionate about.
But you did mention right at the beginning that you feel like you're constantly a beginner in things. So that's good for people to hear, that even someone like you is not just going for, let's say you decided you wanted to try being an artist and painting. You aren't necessarily just naturally, you put maybe you are, but put the paintbrush to the page and then there you go. But you too are working at trying new things, and like you said, you're constantly learning. So that's kind of what I wanted to get to the audience, that if there is something that sounds fun, even if initially you're not great at it, that it can be improved. It can be something that you can grow at. And if you, I just want people to kind of open their minds, not feel like they're pigeonholed into being a runner and that's their only thing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think a lot of great runners too, I think, have some other interests or other side of their life, and that sort of helps balance, like, because I think you can only maintain a certain level of intensity for so long at once, like one of my, like probably the coolest thing I've ever seen happen in sports was at the Vancouver Winter Olympics, where this woman named Petra Majdic, who's a Slovenian cross-country skier, she had come into like several Olympics and world championships as one of the favorites, and something would always go wrong. Like they'd bring the wrong skis or the wrong ski wax, or she'd get sick, or something always went wrong. And finally in Vancouver, she's one of the favorites. I think it was the 1.6K sprint, which is like, you have to do like several rounds in one day. And I know it doesn't sound like a sprint for a runner, but I guess for cross-country skiers it is. And it's hilly too.
Yeah.
And warming up for the first round that day, she slides off like an icy curve and falls into a dried frozen creek bed and hits her side. She's like screaming, gets a quick MRI, and they say no ribs are broken. It's just pain. If you can go, like you can continue. She gets through round one barely, right? They give her another, like try to examine her, say just pain, nothing's broken, so you can continue. Gets through second round, and she's like on the ground screaming after she qualifies based on time for the finals. And they look at her again and they say, just pain, whatever. In the final round, she comes and she's like, you can hear her screaming as she's like using her poles, and she gets the bronze medal, right? And then when they have time to actually examine her, they found that yes, she broke a whole bunch of ribs on the side of her body, and one of them disarticulated. It means like comes off of the rib cage and stabbed her in the lung and punctured her lung, and her lung also collapsed. And so she came to the medal ceremony in a wheelchair with a tube sticking out of her chest, right? And I ended up writing a story about her. And one of the interesting things I found out was that she's so intense that basically one of the breakthroughs a sports psychologist she was working with helped her do was like find some hobbies, right? So you had her like building a house and doing these other things. And it sort of like took the pressure off her. So she wasn't thinking about one thing all the time.
Yeah.
And I found that was like one of her major breakthroughs because she was so naturally inclined to be super intense that she actually needed, like some people need help to become more intense and other people need help to become less intense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she luckily paired up with a sports psychologist who figured that out about her and said like she needs some hobbies.
That's
and
great.
so they started getting her some hobbies and that really helped. But
very interesting.
I know I'm going off on tangent, but I think for runners, that's an interesting story. And so speaking of me being a beginner, right? During the reporting of range, I took 2 beginners online fiction writing courses, total beginners, right? You go there, like nothing I've done matters. Nobody gives a shit who sorry, I could hope you can beat me on the podcast. Nobody cares like anything I've done. And you go in there and all of a sudden, like I'm totally uncomfortable. And one of the exercises, I was stuck with something in writing in range. And so I decided to try something else while I was stuck. And one of the exercises we had to do was writing a story with no dialogue. And after doing that, I realized I had been leaning on using quotes in a lazy way to do explanation that could have been more clearly done in writing. I went through the whole manuscript, stripped a ton of quotes and replaced them with, narration writing basically. And it was so interesting that I didn't even think that I was using quotes in a lazy way until something knocked me out of that. Right. Mm-hmm. So I'm always doing stuff like that. Like I'll take a beginner's class. There was at a hotel, like 2 blocks away from where I live now, there was a conference about like Japanese comic books or something. And so I just like bought a ticket and went and sat in on like the intro Japanese comic books writing class. And like, if you have an open mind about it, you will always learn something. There's no amount of beginning writing classes I could take where I wouldn't learn something. I guarantee it. So I'm constantly like, there's this Zen concept of beginner's mind where you're always like in the mind of the beginner. And that's kind of how I am, I guess.
I've been thinking for a while about taking singing lessons because I really want to be someone who can sing really well. And I love to sing, but I'm not good. And you're really making me think that I might do something because I don't know if you can learn to sing though. I don't know. That might be one thing that you're kind of limited in, but I don't know. I have to look it up.
I would be shocked if you didn't at least improve substantially. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's already a good start where you said, I want to be a person who can, I was reading James Clear, who's a friend and a writer. He wrote a book called Atomic Habits. That's about establishing habits. Mm-hmm. And one of the important aspects is to change your identity as someone who does the certain thing, as opposed to this is just something I do. I am the kind of person who eats healthy, or whatever.
I've talked about it a lot with running. Yeah, definitely.
So I think you're already like thinking about it in the right way.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I've worked hard at that because I often use the example of I used to be the runner named Tina and now I'm Tina the runner. So yeah, I've definitely worked on that. Right. We have gone over here. So I'm just going to give you these 4 questions quickly. Sure. Starting with one piece of advice for life, just in general.
Gosh, so many things are coming into my mind. I mean, I really want to hammer home that idea to people that we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. That
That's great.
You don't know everything about yourself. So try to find new ways to keep learning about yourself.
Great. Okay. What about one person to follow on social media and why?
Maria Konnikova, because she's one of my favorite writers and she's brilliant. And she was researching a book about bluffing and accidentally became a professional poker player. So now she's a poker pro and a writer.
I did read about that. Very interesting. All right. How do you want to be remembered on this show?
As the guy who already had a best-selling book and would still take a beginning writing class.
I think that's great. Yep. And as we haven't really talked about your running at all, I did plan on it, but we kind of went off in different directions. Tell us about a running for real moment, something that only runners will understand.
Well, when I lived on so when I got really into running, where it like started to become part of my identity. Before my junior year of college, I was like fanatical about, I will never miss like a day of my training. And I was going out to Wyoming to meet up with some training partners and got stuck because of these storms in the airport in Denver and was like, I cannot miss my running. And so I used a locker and like stuck my bags in these lockers, held the key and ran 4 miles backwards on the moving walkways. 4 miles backwards. And the airport was packed because everybody couldn't get anywhere. So I'd go backwards on the moving runways, up the down escalators and around and around and around for 4 miles.
Did no one say anything to you? You shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I'm sure I would get arrested if I did it now, but this was, it was pre 9/11.
Okay.
And so I don't think people were as.
That's definitely a running for real moment.
I think I would be too self-conscious to do it now, honestly.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and you'd get mowed down by 100 billion people that are in the airports nowadays.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it was, and this was just summer training. Like I was really far away from any race.
Yeah, we've all done
to think back to like how fanatical I was about it at the time. It's like I almost can't even remember that mindset.
No, I feel the same way now. I've kind of changed my lifestyle around it. All right, so I told you were a dream guest. So you said I need to shoot higher. Who do you admire? Just to finish up, who can I go for next?
I admire a ton of people. Do they have to be a runner?
No, Malcolm Gladwell is on my list, by the way. So you don't need to say him.
Oh, okay.
But go, keep going.
Somebody who'd be right for the list. Yeah, I admire a ton of people and a ton of writers. How about, well, I was about to say Marlon James, but that seems like he's a Jamaican fiction writer who has done, cool. His latest thing is like fantasy, but before that he did this sort of fictionalized account of, well, anyway, this book called The Brief History of Seven Killings he did that won the National Book Award. And embedded in it is a lot of like real history of the US and Jamaica. Okay. And I've been interested in Jamaica for a really long time. There were a lot of Jamaicans at my high school. And that was like one of the ways I got interested in track in the first place. And so I feel like I shouldn't say him because like, are you going to go pursue like a fiction writer for the podcast? I don't know, but I do admire his work.
Okay. That's great. Great suggestion. I will see what I can do. Stay tuned.
Okay.
All right. So we've mentioned Rain. We've mentioned the sports gene. I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. But for anyone else who wants to follow you, where can they find you?
I'm at David Epstein on Twitter, and my website's davidepstein.com.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing this information with us. And I look forward to hearing what my audience thinks of the book, because I'm sure there will be a conversation about it in the community. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
My friends, if you have a minute and you could leave a review on your favorite podcast player, Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Spotify, or whatever else podcast player you use to listen to this podcast, or if you would subscribe to this podcast, you will help me get out in front of new runners to make our tribe even bigger and even better. It might not seem like you as one person can make a difference, but really it helps a lot. And it shows me you appreciate the hard work I put in for those. Thank you so much. Oh, I wish I had more time with him. There was so much more I could have asked, and we didn't even get into running. Now I look back, I probably could have talked to him a little bit longer. He didn't really seem to be in a rush, but I didn't want to abuse this opportunity, and I just wanted him to leave thinking that, we could have kept going. Hopefully he did. Now, I know we went off topic a lot, but I hope you enjoyed that episode. I certainly did, and I would strongly recommend Range. I loved it, and I think you will too. It will really make you think. Now, it is my birthday in just a few days. Could you give me an early birthday gift of subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating with a review as well? Both of those would be so helpful for me and would really show your gratitude, your appreciation to me. Thank you so much, my friend. Next week, we are going to be hearing from Matt Futterman, who wrote the book, which recently came out, called Running to the Edge. It is right down your alley, you guys, the kind of episode that I really think you're going to like, the kind of book that you're going to like. Matt is the deputy sports editor for the New York Times, and he's written this amazing book about Bob Larson, Meb Keflezighi, Dina Castor, and it's just such an interesting book. I couldn't put it down. I just absolutely loved it. So I think you're going to enjoy that one. Until then, my friends, have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Running for Real podcast. Be sure to check out tinamuir.com for show notes and even more helpful running information.